She had no idea this would be the last night of her life. A desperate text, a secluded meeting, a decision that would change everything. What started as a night out with friends ended with 9 gunshots echoing into the night. But who pulled the trigger, and why? The truth behind Ali Costiel's final moments would take investigators down a chilling path, one that led to the last person anyone suspected. And it all started with a single message. Ali Costiel was 21 years old, a student at the University of Mississippi, full of life and promise. To everyone who knew her, she was the epitome of a bright future ahead, charming, ambitious, and deeply passionate about her dreams. Her story should have been one of success, a young woman carving her path in the world, preparing for a future in fashion marketing. But that was before July 19, 2019. Before everything changed in the quiet town of Oxford, Mississippi. That night, Ali spoke to her mother on the phone. It was a typical conversation, one of casual catch-ups. Ali told her she was going out to have some fun with friends. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But what her mother didn't know, what no one could have anticipated, was that it would be their final conversation. A few hours later, Ali's lifeless body was discovered at Sardis Lake, a remote fishing camp, about 45 minutes away from her campus apartment. The scene was nothing short of chilling, multiple gunshot wounds, a young woman's life violently snatched away in the dead of night. The town, usually peaceful and quiet, was shaken. No one could fathom who would do such a thing to Ali, a beloved daughter, a cherished friend, a bright student. Investigators were left to piece together a puzzle with few clues, no apparent motive, and a sense of eerie finality. But as they dug deeper, the case would reveal something no one had expected. The key to solving Ali's murder wasn't a hidden weapon or a shadowy stranger. It was a device most of us carry every day, something Ali herself had worn, her Apple Watch. This seemingly innocent piece of technology would soon become the key to unlocking a chilling truth, one that would uncover secrets no one could have predicted. It would unravel the tangled relationship between Ali and the last person to see her alive, Brandon Thiesfeld, a fellow student, and someone whose dark secrets were about to come to light. In this case, no one was prepared for the truth that would come to light, and the shocking revelation would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. What began as an ordinary evening for Ali would ultimately end in a tragedy that shook a community and left everyone asking, how did it all go so wrong? Ali Costiel's journey to the University of Mississippi was a dream come true. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Ali had always envisioned herself attending a school where she could truly shine, both academically and socially. The University of Mississippi, with its rich history and vibrant student life, seemed like the perfect place for Ali to thrive. The quiet charm of Oxford, Mississippi, offered a stark contrast to her bustling home city, but it was a contrast she welcomed. A small town with big opportunities for a bright student like Ali. Oxford was a picturesque southern town, quaint, calm, and full of the charm that comes with university life. With a population of just 25,000, it wasn't the kind of place where secrets stayed hidden for long. Yet, as peaceful as it seemed, it would soon become the backdrop for a chilling tragedy that no one saw coming. Ali arrived at Ole Miss with high hopes, enrolling in the marketing program with dreams of building a career in the fashion industry. Her energy was contagious, and it didn't take long for her to make an impact on campus. She wasn't just another student. Ali was a force of nature. She had a fierce drive and determination that set her apart. She co-founded the Alpha Phi sorority, was president of the university's golf club, and even spent her free time teaching fitness classes in town. In her words, there was always something to do, always a way to give back. Despite her busy schedule, Ali always made time for the people she cared about. Her family especially was her anchor. Ali's mother, a constant source of love and guidance, often spoke about her daughter's unwavering confidence that she'd find both a fulfilling career and a loving partner while attending school. It was a vision Ali herself shared. As her junior year came to an end, Ali was ready to take on the world. She was looking forward to what the next year would bring. Her final year at Ole Miss, graduation on the horizon, and, perhaps, the beginnings of something even more significant. But there was something, or rather someone, lingering in the background of Allie's life. His name was Brandon Thiesfeld. Their paths first crossed when Allie was just a freshman, and from the moment they met, she found herself captivated by him. Brandon, a handsome, charismatic student from Texas, seemed to check all the boxes for Allie. He was everything she thought she wanted. Confident, outgoing, and on the surface charming. But behind that charm, things weren't as they seemed. What began as a casual relationship between them evolved into something much more complicated. Despite their chemistry, Allie soon found herself trapped in a cycle of on-again, off-again interactions with Brandon. For Allie, he was magnetic, a person she couldn't seem to quit, despite the warning signs her friends had given her about him. Brandon, however, didn't feel the same. He seemed indifferent, distant, and at times even cruel. He would disappear for days, make promises he didn't keep, and leave Allie hurt and confused. But no matter how many times he broke her heart, Allie kept going back to him, believing that maybe, just maybe, things would be different this time. As the months passed, the relationship grew more strained. Friends of Allie began to grow increasingly concerned. They'd seen the way Brandon treated her, how he'd belittle her, take advantage of her, and ultimately dismiss her as if she were nothing more than a passing fling. But despite all the red flags, Allie couldn't stop thinking about him. She wanted him to change, to love her the way she had hoped. As summer approached, the tension between them only intensified. Allie, a senior now, had her future all but planned out. Graduation was just around the corner. But the complications in her relationship with Brandon and the uncertainty of her feelings for him would soon come to a head in the most tragic of ways. The setup of this case isn't just about a girl and a boy. It's about misplaced trust, unrequited love, and the deep, complex feelings that can keep someone tethered to a person they should walk away from. In this seemingly idyllic town, the heart of Mississippi, a storm was quietly brewing, and no one, not even Allie herself, could predict the devastating outcome. It was here, in the heart of college life, with dreams and hopes high, that Allie's story took its darkest turn. And at the center of it all, Brandon Thiesfeld. Allie Costiel's relationship with Brandon Thiesfeld was like a storm on the horizon, slowly building, growing more intense, and inevitable in its destructive path. From the very beginning, there was an undeniable magnetism between them. Allie, a bright, confident young woman, was drawn to Brandon's charm, his easygoing nature, and the allure of his Texas swagger. But beneath the surface, things were never as simple as they seemed. Their relationship was an enigma, one that shifted between the warmth of intimacy and the coldness of distance. They met in Fort Worth, Texas, during Allie's freshman year, a brief encounter that seemed to set the stage for something more. Allie, captivated by his presence, quickly learned that Brandon, like many things in her life, was not as straightforward as she had hoped. Though they dated casually at first, the spark she felt never seemed to be reciprocated in full. For Brandon, Allie was another girl on his radar, another name to add to his list of casual encounters. But for Allie, the connection went far deeper, and she found herself unable to let go. Over the years, their relationship became a cycle of broken promises, ignored texts, and empty assurances. They would reconnect for a brief time, only to fall apart again, leaving Allie feeling discarded and confused. Friends who cared for Allie noticed the pattern, and many of them warned her about Brandon. He was selfish, indifferent, and emotionally unavailable. But Allie was blinded by a love that seemed one-sided, a hope that he would change, that he would one day realize how much she cared. She would make plans with him, only for him to disappear or cancel at the last minute. She'd invite him to meet her friends, but he would make excuses and avoid showing up. Yet, despite the hurt, Allie returned to him again and again, believing that this time things would be different, that maybe this time he would choose her. The emotional toll was evident to those around her. Allie's friends saw her struggle, watched her pour herself into a relationship that gave her nothing in return. They saw how deeply Brandon hurt her, how she tried to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers. To her family, she was the ambitious, driven young woman they had raised, yet here she was, tangled in a relationship that seemed to drain her, leaving her more uncertain about her future than ever before. It was in the summer of 2019 that things began to take a darker turn. Ally, uncertain of her future and her relationship with Brandon, faced a new challenge. She thought she might be pregnant. The possibility of becoming a mother brought Ally and Brandon together once again. But this time, their conversation would not be about love or hope. It would be about fear. Fear that would soon spiral into a tragedy that no one could have predicted. On June 14th, Ally texted Brandon, informing him that she might be pregnant. The message she sent was simple but clear. A photo of a pregnancy test that came back inconclusive. Her heart, no doubt, raced as she awaited his response. But Brandon's reply was swift and cold, his words chilling in their bluntness. "I do not want a kid at all. It will ruin my life. I will not help at all." The text hit Ally hard, but she still held on to hope. She tried to meet him to discuss the situation, but he continuously found excuses to avoid her. He didn't want to face the possibility of being a father. He didn't want to face the consequences of his actions. And Ally, desperate to meet him, kept pushing, trying to find a way to talk through their problems. Days went by, and nothing changed. Brandon continued to ignore her, dodging every attempt Ally made to reach him. Yet, just as Ally had done so many times before, she tried again. She set up a meeting for July 19th, 2019, a meeting that would be their final confrontation. Ally, in a moment of desperation, was willing to give everything to get him to face the reality of their situation. But Brandon, filled with the fear of responsibility and the need to protect his own life, had other plans. The night of July 19th began innocuously enough. Ally, who had spent time at a bar earlier that evening, seemed to be trying to enjoy what was left of her summer. She took an Uber home and, like many of us in our 20s, sought some semblance of closure with the person who had consumed her thoughts for so long. Brandon, too, was preparing for their meeting, but this wasn't going to be a discussion about their future. This was something far darker. When Brandon finally showed up at Ally's apartment hours later, it was almost as if time had stopped. They had both been waiting for this moment for years, though neither knew how to confront it. The meeting that should have been a resolution was instead the beginning of something tragic. They drove to a secluded fishing camp at Sardis Lake, the stillness of the night reflecting the silence between them. But there was no peace to be found. In that silence, something was brewing, a destructive force that neither Ally nor Brandon could stop. It was there, under the dark sky, that the final act of their tragic story unfolded. What began as a hope to mend broken pieces would turn into a crime of violence and fear. A confrontation that had been building for months would end in murder. A loss that no one could have predicted, least of all Ally, who had only wanted answers, closure, and perhaps, just perhaps, a future with someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, love her back. The night of July 19, 2019 was supposed to be the culmination of a difficult, emotionally charged conversation. Ally and Brandon had planned to meet to discuss the possibility of a pregnancy that had been hanging over them for months. But by the early morning hours of July 20th, the reality of that meeting would be anything but a resolution. It would be the violent end of a life full of potential. A tragic moment that forever altered the lives of those who knew Ally and the town of Oxford, Mississippi itself. By 2:15 a.m., the two had arrived at Sardis Lake, a secluded fishing camp away from prying eyes. The camp, quiet and dark under the canopy of stars, seemed like the perfect place to talk, far removed from the chaos of their lives. What was supposed to be a conversation about responsibility and choices, about the uncertainty Ally had been grappling with for months, was instead a catalyst for violence. According to surveillance footage, the two arrived together, with photos later revealing they'd been drinking White Claw and snacking as they drove, seemingly trying to ease the tension that had built up over their fractured relationship. But by the time Ally was found, hours later, lying lifeless on the ground, it was clear that the tension had boiled over in a way no one could have foreseen. A neighbor out walking their dog reported hearing gunshots around 2:30 a.m., just as Ally and Brandon would have arrived at the camp. The chilling echo of those shots rang through the quiet night, signaling the violent end of Ally's life. It wasn't until 10:30 a.m. that morning, when a passing police officer conducted a routine patrol through the camp, that the scene was discovered. the officer stumbled upon a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Ally's body, face down, surrounded by a few simple items: her purse, 2 cans of White Claw, and a bag of snacks. A jacket lay on a nearby picnic table, a stark contrast to the gruesome reality unfolding around him. As the officer approached, the horrifying truth became clear. Ally had been gunned down. She wasn't just shot once or twice. No, the brutality of the crime was evident in the number of wounds on her body. 9 shots, fired at close range. The sheer violence of it stunned even the most seasoned investigators. In all his years on the force, the officer would later admit he had never seen someone hit so many times. As authorities confirmed Ally's identity and began processing the crime scene, they were left with more questions than answers. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that this had been a robbery or a random act of violence. It was personal. A crime of passion, perhaps, or one motivated by something far darker. But who could have committed such an atrocity? Who would want to hurt Ally, a well-loved, vibrant student with a future ahead of her? And why was she targeted? The investigation into Ally's murder quickly focused on one person, Brandon Thiesfeld. Though his name had been mentioned by a few of Ally's friends during initial interviews, it wasn't until investigators gained access to Ally's apartment that they uncovered the key piece of evidence that would change the course of the investigation. Among her personal belongings, investigators found Ally's Apple Watch, an unexpected but crucial breakthrough. With the watch, they could trace Ally's final moments with eerie precision. Her texts, location data, and even her fitness tracking information painted a clear picture of her last hours. The texts sent to Brandon, messages exchanged just before her death, revealed a truth no one had expected. It was a relationship that had been anything but simple, and now it was clear. Brandon was the last person to speak to Ally before her murder. The watch's data confirmed what the police had suspected. Brandon was, in fact, the last person to see Ally alive. The Apple Watch showed Ally had sent a few final texts to him around 10:30 p.m., telling him she might be pregnant and urging him to talk things through. But instead of a heart-to-heart conversation, she had met her tragic end hours later. The trail of digital breadcrumbs left behind by Ally's watch was the most damning evidence they could have hoped for. It was undeniable. Brandon Thiesfeld was connected to the crime, but what had led him to commit such a violent act? As investigators pieced together the details, they began to unravel the full extent of the toxic relationship between Ally and Brandon. Text messages between the two revealed a complex, emotionally fraught situation. For months, Ally had led Brandon to believe she was pregnant, a lie that weighed heavily on her. The texts between them, full of fear, confusion, and urgency, were the final tragic proof of how desperate Ally had become in her attempt to reach him. But Brandon, terrified of being trapped by a future he didn't want, refused to face his responsibility. Instead, he chose a darker path, one that ended with Ally's murder. As the investigation continued, things only got worse for Brandon. When police searched his phone and obtained his location data, they confirmed his movements matched the timeline of Ally's murder. They also discovered something that sealed his fate. Brandon had fled Mississippi just after the shooting, abandoning Ally's body and heading toward Tennessee in an attempt to evade capture. But the authorities were already closing in. A bolo, be on the lookout, was issued for Brandon's truck, an $80,000 Ford F-150, and within hours they tracked him down in Memphis. When they arrested him, it only got worse. In his truck, they found a .40 caliber handgun, a weapon that matched the one used to kill Ally. Brandon was taken back to Mississippi, where he would eventually be charged with murder. But as the investigation progressed, more damning evidence came to light. Ally's Apple Watch had provided the final, irrefutable proof of Brandon's guilt. The case of Ally Costiel's murder had been a whirlwind of unanswered questions, chilling evidence, and a gut-wrenching reality for her loved ones. Investigators had built a compelling case. Her Apple Watch had provided them with a digital roadmap of her final hours, her text messages had painted a picture of emotional turmoil, and her friends' testimonies had highlighted the toxic nature of her relationship with Brandon Thiesfeld. But despite all of this, there was still one looming question. Why? Why had Brandon, a privileged college student with the world at his feet, felt the need to commit such a brutal crime? What had pushed him over the edge? The answer, it seemed, lay in Brandon's own actions after the murder. In the hours following Ally's death, he didn't grieve. He didn't confess. He didn't even attempt to cover his tracks. Instead, he ran. He packed his bags, grabbed his expensive Ford F-150, and headed north, crossing state lines into Tennessee, leaving Ally's body behind, as if she were nothing more than a problem he had solved. But Brandon had made a fatal mistake. He underestimated the reach of modern technology, the diligence of law enforcement, and the sheer weight of the evidence against him. By the time he crossed into Memphis, he was already a marked man. Investigators, tracking his movements through his phone and vehicle, had a clear idea of where he was headed. They knew he was trying to escape, but they also knew he wouldn't get far. A bolo. Be on the lookout alert was issued for his truck, and it didn't take long for law enforcement to spot it. A patrol unit in Memphis intercepted Brandon on a quiet stretch of road. To anyone else, he might have seemed like just another college kid on a summer road trip. But to the officers who approached him, he was something else entirely. He was a suspect, a man on the run, a killer trying to outrun the consequences of his crime. When they pulled him over, Brandon was eerily calm. He didn't fight, he didn't resist, he simply sat there, his privileged arrogance still intact, as if he believed his father's money or his own smooth-talking charm would get him out of this mess. But this time, there would be no easy escape. As officers searched his truck, they found something that sealed his fate, a .40 caliber Glock handgun, tucked away as if it were just another belonging. Ballistics testing would later confirm what investigators already suspected. This was the same weapon that had fired the bullets that tore through Ally's body. But the evidence didn't stop there. As police went through his belongings, they found something even more damning. Something that revealed the inner workings of Brandon Thiesfeld's mind in the days leading up to Ally's murder. A handwritten letter, scrawled out in Brandon's own words, addressed to his parents. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession of remorse. It was something far darker. In it, Brandon spoke of the dark thoughts that had been plaguing him for years. He described an urge he couldn't control, an impulse that he had finally acted upon. He didn't express sorrow for what he had done, only regret that he had been caught. When investigators read the letter, they realized what they were dealing with wasn't just a panicked college student who had made a tragic mistake. Brandon Thiesfeld wasn't just someone who had snapped in a moment of fear. No, this had been something else entirely. This had been planned. Further investigation into Brandon's movements in the days before the murder confirmed their suspicions. Just days before he killed Ally, Brandon had searched online for information about silencers, gun modifications, and ways to kill without getting caught. He had even visited a local gun store and purchased the very ammunition that would later be found at the crime scene. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated murder. At that moment, any lingering doubts about his guilt were erased. This wasn't just a case of a young man making a terrible decision in the heat of the moment. Brandon Thiesfeld had planned Ally Costiel's murder. He had driven her to that remote location with a purpose. He had pulled that trigger not once, not twice, but 9 times. And now, with the walls closing in, with the weight of his actions finally bearing down on him, Brandon sat in the back of a police car, staring blankly ahead, as if he still couldn't quite comprehend the reality he had created for himself. For investigators, this was the final piece of the puzzle. They had the motive. They had the weapon. They had the confession, if not spoken aloud, then written in Brandon's own hand. There would be no loophole, no technicality that could save him now. The case against him was airtight. Ally had spent years chasing after Brandon, believing he was someone worth loving, someone worth fighting for. But in the end, he had repaid that love with cold-blooded murder. And now, the law would ensure that he would spend the rest of his life paying for it. Brandon Thiesfeld never planned to be a father. In fact, the mere idea of it terrified him. To him, responsibility was a burden meant for others, something his father's money had always shielded him from. And now, Ally Costiel, The girl he had spent years stringing along was threatening the one thing he valued most, his freedom. For months, Ally had been telling him she might be pregnant. Whether she truly believed it, or whether it was a desperate attempt to keep him close, no one would ever know. But for Brandon, it didn't matter. He wasn't going to stick around to find out. He wasn't going to be tied down. And he certainly wasn't going to let a baby ruin his life. His first instinct was to ignore her, just like he had so many times before. He brushed off her texts, ghosted her calls, and acted as though she didn't exist. But Ally was persistent. She wanted answers. She wanted to talk. She wanted him to face this, like an adult, like a man. And that's when Brandon made his decision. If Ally refused to go away, he would make her go away. Permanently. In the days leading up to the murder, Brandon's internet search history painted a terrifying picture of premeditation. He wasn't just thinking about how to avoid fatherhood. He was planning a way to eliminate the problem entirely. Authorities later discovered that he had been researching gun silencers, ballistics, and how to commit murder without leaving behind evidence. He even visited a gun store, purchasing extra rounds of ammunition that would later be found at the crime scene. Even more chilling? A text he sent to a friend days before the murder. It was short, blunt, and disturbingly void of emotion. "I might kill her." It wasn't a joke. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was a confession before the crime had even been committed. And then on July 19th, he put his plan into motion. When Brandon Thiesfeld was arrested in Memphis, his arrogance had not yet faded. He refused to speak. He refused to cooperate. He acted as though this was just another minor inconvenience, something he could escape like he always had before. But this time, there would be no escape. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. As investigators combed through his belongings, they found something unexpected, something that would reveal a glimpse into his disturbed mind. A handwritten letter addressed to his parents. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a full confession. It was a self-indulgent rambling of a man who had finally acted on the dark thoughts he had spent years harboring. "I've been struggling with terrible thoughts for a long time," he wrote. "I don't know why I'm the way that I am. I've always had these thoughts, and I finally acted on them." But even in his so-called confession, there was no real remorse. No sorrow for Ally, for her family, for the life he had stolen. He wasn't sorry for the crime. He was only sorry that he got caught. As investigators continued to gather evidence, they uncovered one final cruel twist. Ally Costiel wasn't pregnant. She never had been. The autopsy confirmed what should have been painfully obvious to Brandon had he ever truly listened to her. There was no baby. There never had been. Ally had spent months believing she might be carrying Brandon's child, but she had never once taken a second test to confirm it. Whether she knew she wasn't pregnant, or whether she was holding on to hope that she was, remains unknown. But Brandon didn't care about the truth. He didn't care about confirmation. He had already decided that Ally was a threat to his future, and he handled that threat the only way he knew how, violently. Had he simply waited, had he given Ally even a moment of genuine conversation, he would have realized that there was nothing to run from. No baby, no forced commitment, no ruined future. But Brandon Thiesfeld wasn't the type of person to think before he acted. He was the type to destroy first and deal with the consequences later. Now, the only future he had left was inside a prison cell. When faced with overwhelming evidence, Brandon had no choice but to accept reality. Though he was initially charged with capital murder, a charge that could have put him on death row, his defense team negotiated a plea deal. In exchange for taking the death penalty off the table, Brandon agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was handed down. Life in prison. No easy way out. No daddy's money to save him. No second chances. For Ally's family, there was no real justice, no punishment severe enough to make up for the life that had been stolen from them. They had lost their daughter, their friend, their bright light. And for what? Because a privileged, selfish boy didn't want to have an uncomfortable conversation? Because he was too much of a coward to simply tell the truth? As Brandon Thiesfeld was led away in handcuffs, his life reduced to nothing more than a prison number, the world finally saw him for what he truly was. Not a heartbroken young man who made a mistake, but a cold-blooded killer who saw no value in the life of the girl who had loved him. And now he will spend the rest of his days rotting behind bars, left alone with the thoughts he had always been too afraid to face. Justice had been served, at least that's what the law would call it. Brandon Thiesfeld, once a free man with limitless opportunities, now sat in a prison cell with no future, no escape, and no one left to shield him from the consequences of his actions. Life in prison, no parole until he was 65. But what was a sentence on paper compared to the reality of what he had stolen? Ally Costiel was supposed to graduate in the spring of 2020. She had dreams of working in the fashion industry, of traveling the world, of finding the kind of love that she had once believed Brandon could give her. She had a mother and father who adored her, friends who cherished her, and a future so bright that even those around her felt inspired by her ambition. And in a single moment, in a flash of selfishness and violence, all of that was gone. The finality of it was suffocating. Her parents, now left with only memories, would never get to see their daughter walk across that stage and accept her diploma. They would never get to hear about her first real job, meet the man she would one day fall in love with, or see her build the future she had been working so hard for. Instead, they were left with an empty bedroom, old photographs, and the kind of grief that never truly fades. Brandon Thiesfeld wasn't just a murderer. He was a coward. A man who had every opportunity to choose a different path, but instead he chose destruction. He chose murder over responsibility. He chose to silence Ally forever rather than face the reality of his own actions. And for what? A pregnancy that never even existed? A future he was never being forced into? The senselessness of it all was impossible to comprehend. As news of Ally's murder spread, shockwaves rippled through Oxford, Mississippi, and beyond. She became more than just a statistic, more than just another headline. She was a reminder of how dangerous obsession can be, how misplaced love can lead to tragedy, and how some people, no matter how much they are given, will never be satisfied. But Ally's story didn't end with her murder. Her parents, determined to honor their daughter's memory, refused to let her name be forgotten. They shared her story. They fought for justice, and they made sure the world knew exactly who she was, not as a victim, but as a person. A young woman with dreams, with a heart full of love, and with a future that should have been hers to live. Brandon may have stolen Ally's life, but he could never erase her legacy. And now, as he sits in his prison cell, the rest of his life stretching out before him in an endless, monotonous blur, he has nothing left but time. Time to think about what he did. Time to relive the moment he pulled that trigger. Time to wonder if it was all worth it. Because the truth is, Brandon Thiesfeld didn't just destroy Ally's life. He destroyed his own. And for that, he will never be free.